All right, it is 12 o'clock. We are going to get started. I just want to thank you all for joining us today for our net metering webinar. My name is Sam Dunaiski. I am the Executive Director with Renew Wisconsin. Joining me today off to the side, behind the scenes, is my colleague Alex Beld from Renew. He's going to be providing us with some administrative support throughout the day. So I just want to send a quick thank you to Alex beforehand. He's going to be dropping some links and doing some other things during the webinar that's going to help things hopefully progress pretty quickly and pretty easily. Later on, we're going to be joined by Stanley Minnick from Arch Solar. He is a employee of Arch, which is a Wisconsin solar installation firm, and they are going to discuss a little bit more about what local companies are seeing out in the field around net metering. So, as I said before, I am Sam Dunaiski. I am with Renew Wisconsin. I'm the executive director. I've been here for a little over 5 years, although just in the executive director role here since late 2022. Renew Wisconsin is a nonprofit organization that promotes renewable energy in Wisconsin. We work on policies and programs that expand solar power, wind power, renewable fuels, local hydropower, building electrification, energy storage, and electric vehicles around the state. Since 1991, we have been a champion for clean energy solutions here in Wisconsin. And our mission is to both lead and accelerate the transformation to Wisconsin's renewable energy future through advocacy, education, and collaboration. If you're interested in learning more about us or becoming a member of Renew, Alex is going to drop the link to membership in the chat. If you're also just interested in learning more about renewable energy in our state, you can also subscribe to our newsletter as well, which will help you get a lot of that very pertinent information. So at this point, I want to go over some house rules. We're going to be talking quite a lot today, but I just want to make sure everyone is more or less on the same page. So on the bottom of your screen, you should see two main buttons. There's a chat button and a Q&A function. Messages and website links from Renew will pop up in the chat function. So if you see a little red button pop up, or a little red icon pop up there, I should say, you can click on that to learn more. If you have a particular question or clarifying ask about a slide, you can put that in the chat function as well, and we'll try to address it as best we can in real time. But for all other questions, please put those in the Q&A function. Try to be as specific as you can with those questions. We are going to reserve some time at the end of the discussion today for some audience Q&A. And I hope that we will be able to get to as many of those questions as we can. I know there's going to be a lot of folks on today's webinar, so we might be a little strapped for time at the end, but we're going to do our best to try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. And then finally, last bit here is voting. You can vote for questions that you like. So another good reason to stay engaged, keep an eye on that Q&A box. If there's a question in there that you like, or you're planning to ask, or you want to hear more from us on, please upvote for that question. And that will mean it's more likely that we'll be able to answer it. Of course, there are no guarantees, but we're going to do our best to try to get to all the questions today. I'm going to go over our agenda very briefly. First, we're going to be discussing the basics. So obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about net metering, but to understand net metering better, we're going to have to talk a little bit about solar. We're going to do just a brief, but hopefully concise Solar 101 session, if you will. After that, we're going to go through some of the impacts and implications from net metering. What does this policy do for Wisconsin? What, in theory, can this policy do for Wisconsin? Then we're going to go into what I have affectionately called the dark side of this topic. We're going to be doing a little myth busting. We're going to be talking about some arguments against net metering, and we're also going to be talking about some risks as well. We're going to be talking about what has happened in other states or other areas that have gone away from this very important policy. And then, as I said at the end, we're going to reserve some time for a little discussion and a little Q&A with Stanley from the solar installer perspective of this side of the equation. And then again, finally, at the end, we're going to reserve some time for question and answers. Again, this is your reminder to please keep your eye on that Q&A box and to engage with it as best you can. So from here, we're going to go into a little bit of Solar 101. So there's a lot of folks on the call today that this, might be, I shouldn't say a lot, but there might be some folks on the call today that already understand solar. But in understanding net metering, it is fundamental that we understand the principles of a grid-tied solar system. And in addition to that, I want to say that throughout the conversation today, I'm going to be speaking at more of a higher level. We're going to be speaking a little bit more in generalities. There's going to be big differences between solar systems, between meter setups, between utility policies, et cetera, et cetera. There might be, some little tweaks and differences to certain folks and how the technology and the policy works for them individually. So I just ask that you keep that in mind today. I'm going to try to just do a broad brush stroke of what we're all talking about, but just something to keep in mind there as well. So like I said, this webinar is on net metering, but again, to understand just what net metering is and why it's important and why it works, we have to start with the basics of solar. So we're going to start with what is better known as a grid-tied solar array. This is the vast majority of all of the solar that gets installed, not only in Wisconsin, but really across the US. So let's look at how a solar array works. During the day, especially a nice summer day like today, photons from the sun are going to hit those solar panels. So solar panels are primarily comprised of two different materials. And I want to press pause there. I'm sorry, I'm already a little off track. I want to say there are three main components to a solar system. They're the solar panels, of course, that I just talked about. There's also an inverter or a micro inverter. What that does is that changes the DC electricity that the solar panels make to AC electricity, which is what our homes and appliances and electronics use. And then the third component to a solar array is the meter. And again, that also can take different forms as well. But most folks already know about solar panels. I think most folks already know about meters as well. I think we all have meters in our homes and our residences. Inverter is probably the one thing that most people aren't super familiar with, but we're going to go over a little bit more about those three different components right now and kind of talk about how they interact with each other. So to go back, when the photons from the sun hit those solar panels, there's two layers of silicon for most solar panels. One is a positively charged side, one is a negatively charged side. When the photons hit that panel, it excites the electrons within them. They naturally gravitate away from the negatively charged side and towards the positive side. And then those electrons are funneled or flow through wires to the inverter. So that inverter in this photo is a string inverter, but there are also micro inverters, which are, as you can probably guess, are little small inverters that are attached individually to each solar panel. But essentially, the electron, the DC current from those solar cells flows into that inverter. DC current, by the way, can only move in one direction, which is really important. When the inverter converts it to AC electricity or alternating current, AC can move both directions. And that's very important for our conversation as well as we move forward. But essentially, what is happening in this process is a chemical reaction. It's a chemical process. There's not a whole lot to break down, which is why solar panels can last years and years and decades and decades. So as that electricity leaves the solar panel and again goes to the inverter where it is converted into alternating current, from that point, it flows into the circuit breaker box, at which point it is then distributed throughout the building. It goes into lights, appliances, electronics, outlets, things like that, that allow us to power our homes, our businesses, and other buildings that we use throughout the day. So that is essentially how the solar component of a grid-connected solar system works. That is what happens during the daytime. At night, this building will pull electricity in from the grid, from the utility, in the same way that a normal or non-solarized building, all those buildings typically do. So what happens there is at night, or cloudy days or other periods of time when the solar array is not producing enough electricity for the building, what will happen is that electricity will then be called upon from the utility. It will flow through the meter, and then it will flow into the circuit box, and then again out to where it is called upon, to the appliances, to the electronics, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is electricity can flow in from the grid, and it can also, through a grid-connected solar system, actually flow out back onto the grid. And this actually happens a lot, especially, again, on sunny, long days in the summer like today. Those solar panels are going to produce, from time to time, in real time, more electricity than this building needs. At that point, it flows back onto the grid. You can kind of think of it a little bit like a stopped up sink. It will stop flowing down the drain, and then it will flow to another part. So when the building, when the inverter recognizes that there is enough power to the building, it will then send it again back out to the grid through the meter. That electric meter will keep track of that electricity, and it will go on to the grid. It will go on to the neighbor, to the neighbor's neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, wherever that electricity is being called upon. But whether it's exported energy or consumed energy, they both flow through the electric utility meter. And that meter, again, is why I pointed it out before. It's really important. It's a really important piece in this conversation because it keeps track of how much electricity is exported and also how much electricity is coming into the system as well. And they can take on different forms, but essentially that's what the meter's job is to do. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I want to preface it by saying that as a presenter and sometimes as an attendee of webinars and presentations, I really dislike it when the presenter puts a lot of text on a slide. You don't know whether you should be reading the text or listening to the person talking. I also really do not like when I do have to have text on my slides, reading that text verbatim. Most of my attendees know how to read, so I hate to do that. But with that said, I am going to break both of those rules right now for a very important reason. And that is I want to show you all the definition of what is net metering. So net metering is a utility billing policy that enables customers who generate electricity from their own solar systems to receive a bill credit for any energy they export to the grid. And to kind of back up that statement, traditional net metering as we know it is a bill credit that represents the full retail value of the distributed electricity delivered from the solar array to the distribution system. And I have full retail value underlined because that phrase is going to come up a lot more in our conversations throughout the day today. This definition, by the way, is from SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association. So this is not a definition that Renew has come up with on our own. This is what the industry agrees to be as the definition of net metering. And again, the main emphasis on this is in that full retail value of the distributed electricity delivered to the distribution system. So for those of you that don't like text, and that includes me and our more visual learners, this next slide, if I can get to it, is a visual representation, hopefully a good one, of just how net metering works. So during the day, as I said, when you export electricity to the grid, electricity flows from your home to the grid, and your meter accounts for that. It essentially goes backwards. It keeps track of all that electricity that you export, and then it allows you to build that up throughout the day. Now at night, as you see here, when electricity, when the building or the home needs to pull electricity from the grid, that electricity flows from the lines to the home, and then that meter then again accounts for that electricity. It's essentially the difference between going backward and going forward. Essentially, what net metering is it is the difference between the electricity that the home or the building consumes from the grid and the solar electricity that the building or the home exports to the grid. And that net is added up or totaled out over a given time frame. So usually that net period, as we call it, is monthly or is billing, but the netting period can and is different from utility to utility and state to state. Some utilities actually have annual net metering periods, which is really great for a state like Wisconsin, where we have much longer days in the summer and much shorter days in the winter. That solar owner is able to bank those kilowatt hours and use them not only throughout the day or the month, but actually throughout the year as well. On the inverse side of that equation, however, some billing periods, some netting periods can actually be even shorter. They can be daily or even hourly in theory. It really just depends upon the policy of the state or the policy of the utility at the time. But again, the really important thing to remember is this can be summarized down to a very simple math equation that even my 9-year-old can understand. Essentially, net metering is consumed electricity subtracted from exported electricity to the grid. And the owner of that building, the owner of that solar array, at the end of the month or at the end of the billing period, they pay whatever is the result of that, plus whatever fixed or customer charges that might be added on as well. So typically, this policy is hopefully, as I have explained it, pretty easy to understand. Like I said, it's just a simple math equation. But if you need a little bit more visual explanation or visual understanding, this slide, I think, also does a really, really great job of that. So this slide essentially combines the two previous animations into one. It combines that meter slide, as I showed you, plus the home energy use system and how it's interconnected with the grid. So I want to explain a little bit more about what's going on in this graph, because it might look kind of busy and it might look like there's a lot going on, but this is a real person solar array. As you can see by the date down there, it was taken September 22nd, 2017. A lot of advancements have happened in between then and now, but we won't get into that right now. Along the bottom there, the x-axis, that represents a time throughout the day. So it starts at midnight and goes up until 11:59 p.m. On the left side, or the y-axis, you have the amount of electricity. So that's in watts right there. That's 1,000 watts, 2,000, 3,000 watts, et cetera, et cetera. To explain the different colors, you can already see what they represent, but I'll explain it a little more. The area in red is where this building is consuming electricity. And the red specifically is where it's consuming electricity from the grid. So as you can see in the early morning hours, there's several spikes there. That's probably a refrigerator or a freezer cycling on or something like that. In the later morning, sometime between 8 and noon, this person is probably waking up, maybe having some coffee or some breakfast. And then as we get into the later afternoon hours in the evening, there's also dips and spikes as well. But the important takeaway from this is, as you can clearly see, a home does not use electricity on a nice, steady, even basis, which is very much the opposite in comparison to our solar production. So the area underneath the green curve is where this solar array is producing energy in real time. So as you can see, just a little bit before 8 a.m. as the sun rises, those solar panels kick into gear. They continue to increase in the amount of electricity they produce throughout the day, topping off a little bit around the noon or the 1 p.m. hour. And then, because this is September and it's Wisconsin, as the sun starts to set, that energy production begins to ramp down until a little bit after 5 or 6 o'clock there, when it goes away completely. So that area in green is where that is solar energy that is being produced by the solar array, but can't be utilized by the solar owner. So it gets exported onto the grid. It goes again down to the neighbor's neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. Now the area in blue is something very important as well. It's the smallest of the 3 areas, but this is where this building, this owner, is using that solar to offset their electronics, their appliances, their usage in real time. And as like I said, it represents a pretty small area because we typically use power intermittently throughout the day. As we see, it's really important. We can almost use net metering, individual solar owners, I should say, can almost use net metering as like a virtual battery backup. But the important takeaway from here, again, is that homes, buildings do not use electricity steadily throughout the day. There's valleys, there's peaks as well, that make net metering really important when we talk about how we use our electricity, where we send it to, and what we do with that extra electricity. I want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits to net metering. There are many, many, many to talk about, tons of benefits. I'm going to start with some of the grid or overall system benefits. And I want to talk first of all about grid stability. So what all of these individual solar systems do is they add electricity generation to the grid. This helps to smooth out the demand curve. We don't have to rely on coal plants and gas plants to produce all of that electricity throughout the day. So this leads to a more resilient grid, right? As we add more energy from these individual solar arrays, as we distribute them throughout the distribution system, that helps to smooth out or lower our demand curve, so our demands aren't peaking quite as much throughout the day. This also means there's less need for inefficient coal and gas peaker plants to rev up, which can be A, very costly, and B, oftentimes can be rather polluting as well. There's a great example over the last few months from the Texas grid. You may have heard quite a bit about the Texas grid over the last couple of years or so. Texas, along with a lot of the southern US, has been undergoing an extreme heat wave. There have been very hot, very sunny days, but Texas also happens to have a lot of solar on its grid, both at the utility level and behind the meter. So what has been happening in Texas is, even though it's been very hot, the grid has been able to stay pretty stable. Solar has actually performed, or in some cases overperformed, some of the forecasts that have been placed for solar over the last few months. So essentially, solar has really been helping out the grid in Texas at a time when it really, really needs that help. The next point I want to make is that rooftop solar, it takes a lot of workers, right? We need more people. It's just a harder job to install solar on a rooftop or at a home as it is to install big solar farms in fields and farms and things like that. So it does take more workers to construct, but it is important to note that those workers, those companies, are being paid for by individuals, right? By residents, homeowners, businesses, et cetera, et cetera. They're not, those people are not being paid necessarily by utilities, by ratepayers, et cetera. They're being paid from private funds, from individuals that are adding solar to their own buildings. So this helps add to the local economy. It helps strengthen jobs in our local economy. These are jobs that clearly cannot be outsourced, right? We need folks in our communities to come to our homes and our businesses and our buildings to put these solar panels on the roofs themselves. And then the last point I want to add about net metering benefits system-wide is all of these solar panels and solar systems together add up, and they create a pretty decent amount of non-fossil fuel generating resources. So this allows us as a community to invest more in renewables. At the same time, utilities are also investing in renewable energy. They're investing in solar farms and wind farms. We have a big task before us, people. We have a lot of decarbonization to do in order to get us to a decarbonized society. And that's going to take teamwork. We need the utilities doing these projects, and we need individuals. We need to empower individuals to be able to install their own solar as well. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that I don't have on this slide that I should probably at least make a mention of. You know, as we reduce fossil fuels, of course, that reduces pollution. That can have really beneficial public health benefits. Energy security as well. We're not reliant on volatile fuel pricing or perhaps even geopolitical situations around the world that might do things to those fuel prices as well. And then, of course, climate change. These solar arrays will certainly help us mitigate some of those big climate impacts as we move forward as well. I also want to talk a little bit more about individual benefits to net metering. So we talked about like grid or system-wide benefits to allowing individuals to put that excess solar on the grid and send it down to their neighbor and their neighbor's neighbor. What net metering does, and again, this is where I want to bring up this phrase again, it represents the full retail value of that electricity. And that full retail value is very, very important for many, many reasons. But the biggest reason is that it represents predictable cost savings. It represents a very easy way for individuals, businesses to calculate their payback or their return on investment. We can look at historically, over an average, how much solar hits Wisconsin over a month or even over a year time. We can take those kind of averages, plug them into the size of our system, figure out how many kilowatt hours we're likely to generate over months or even years. And we can apply the number of kilowatt hours that we produce and apply that directly to the retail value of those kilowatt hours. So it makes for a very, very easy payback calculation method, and not only a very easy one to calculate, also a very predictable one as well. And this can often not be as impacted even by rate changes as well. If you're just offsetting your electricity, it's not going to impede payback as much as it would be if those rates were subject to something else. Another reason why net metering is really beneficial to the individual that installs that solar. Americans, we really like being in control of our lives. Technology allows this, solar allows this, net metering also really allows this. Solar technology and net metering gives us the ability to take control of our energy usage and provide another option for ourselves going forward when we talk about energy. Everyone uses energy at this point. It's basically food, clothing, shelter, and energy, and maybe internet as well, but you need energy to get internet. So everyone is using energy, but we want to, as Americans, again, and even as individuals, take more control about how we control those costs and how we control our own energy usage as well. And then finally, I also want to mention that net metering allows low and moderate income customers to offset their electricity bills and hedge against rising utility costs. Quite often for low and moderate income customers, utility bills, utility expenses are their second highest expense throughout the month. And if we can create a predictable and an easy to calculate payback structure for those LMI folks, that's going to lead to more solar adoption. If we restrict it to just very wealthy individuals, there's only so much solar that we can do in our communities outside of the utilities that's going to help us get to some of these goals, that's going to help us, again, keep our grid resilient, reduce pollution, et cetera, et cetera. One other thing I want to mention, and I didn't really get a chance to talk to this is kind of going back to the energy independence point, is I also want to make a note that net metering also incentivizes solar owners to not use solar at peak times. You saw that curve, right? And all of that energy that was distributed kind of evenly throughout the day. If these net metering policies were to go away, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit more, people would be more compelled to do things like run their dishwasher or do laundry during the sunny periods of the day, which typically are also, when we talk about the grid, those are also the peak times, which is really a perverse way of looking at how we use our energy. So net metering also incentivizes solar owners to be more efficient with the energy that they use. So as I've said before, there are many, many, many benefits both to the individual and to the grid or to the system for net metering, which is, I just cannot overemphasize this point enough, why net metering is so important to us. At this point, we've kind of reached the intermission stage. I see my colleague Stanley Minnick from Arch Solar on the line. Stanley, I desperately need to take a sip of water. Would you like to weigh in here and maybe correct anything that I may have misstated or add anything on to that from your perspective? I know we're going to talk a little bit more later on in the program, but I just want to give you an opportunity to maybe make any quick tweaks or corrections that I may have erred in.
Thanks, Sam, and for the folks attending. Stanley Minnick with Arch Solar. Arch, if you don't know, has been doing solar and electrical work in Wisconsin for 20 years. We've got about 100 employees between our different business units, and basically do systems from 10 to 5 and 10,000 panels. So just a tiny bit of background. And then as far as something that stuck out to me when you were just talking about the reasons that net metering is important, I'd say in Wisconsin, net metering is important because if you look at surrounding states, whether it was Iowa in the 2016, 2017, Minnesota shortly after, and Illinois, there's been crazy huge incentives available for clean energy, which means those markets, the solar industry has grown many multiples in some cases what Wisconsin's has grown to. So one of the reasons I think net metering is so important in Wisconsin is because we haven't had incentive plans and structures in place for years that allow us to get to the point where they are in Illinois or where they are in Minnesota. So that was one little wrinkle I wanted to add. You also mentioned the not really a correction, but a little nuance thing for anybody. You're using the grid as like virtual storage, but you kind of mentioned backup. Like obviously, I think that was just maybe the wasn't the phrase you meant or whatever. Not a huge deal, but obviously without the grid or without a battery, solar is not going to really provide that backup during an outage in the vast majority of cases. There were also a few questions that came in. If you'd like, I could see how comfortable I am with any of these,
We're
Sam, or
gonna we're gonna
you can.
hold all the questions until the end, Stanley, unless they were
Sounds
like
good.
specifically about a
Nope.
slide. But yeah, why don't
Cool.
we we'll hold those till the end. But yeah, folks continue to keep putting in those questions and again continue to vote for the ones that you definitely like to see us answer or at least attempt to answer. At this point, I had built this in to give myself again another little bit of a break from talking, but we have a poll. Alex, if you wouldn't mind sort of launching that poll right now. I just want to kind of figure out, gauge the audience, where is your interest in net metering? So there's a few different options there. Some include solar that you want to do, maybe include some community goals or other. Please do your best to honestly answer that question as best you can, just so we have a kind of a good idea about where we're coming from. I think you can choose multiple options, but I could be wrong there. So if you all could answer that question, so just so we can kind of get a better sense of where you're all coming from, that would be fantastic. Stanley, we didn't get a chance to mention this. I forgot to mention it, I should say, at the top of the hour, but I just want to remind everyone that today's webinar is being recorded. We're not going to be able to have slides for folks, but we are going to have a recording of this presentation, which will be available to everyone sometime after we conclude today. So I just wanted to mention that as well, giving folks a little bit more time to answer. It looks like we have a pretty evenly distributed set of answers here. Most folks concerned about climate change. A lot of folks already have solar, so that's great. You will probably already not only understand how solar works, but you probably also already have a little bit of an idea of how net metering works. But I want to talk a little bit more about why net metering is so important now. We've kind of talked about it from these sort of high level impacts, but I want to get into some market impacts as well. So what I want to talk about right now is the deployment of solar, not just how we've been doing it so far, but more of the future deployment of solar, what net metering and what some other policies represent. I've already talked about how much of a win-win scenario net metering is, but I want to talk about some other policies that can potentially also affect the market and how they stack up to net metering. So 2 years ago in 2021, the PSC, the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, it commissioned a study from Cadmus. Cadmus did 2 studies. They did a technical potential of rooftop solar and they did a market potential for rooftop solar. What the technical potential study did is basically just took a look at all of the unshaded rooftops in Wisconsin. It didn't look at who owned them or how they were connected to the grid. It didn't look at if they were suitable from an engineering, from a building standpoint or not. It just looked at where do we have roof space, where could we potentially put solar panels. Essentially what it did is it gave us a ceiling of how much rooftop solar we could get if we just indiscriminately put solar panels everywhere. Then, because that is not a super realistic way of looking at our market, they also looked at 5 potential scenarios from a market potential study perspective as well. So what those 5 scenarios looked at are represented here on this graph. The baseline scenario is essentially status quo or business as usual, our current policies in place with no real changes anytime soon. The other 4 represent different policy changes. So we have increased incentives from the Focus on Energy program. Currently, those sit at around $500 for a home, but then they can vary quite a bit by business or by commercial installations. Extension of the federal investment tax credit. They also looked at a scenario involving attractive financing, which basically means third-party status would be legalized, and we would be looking at financing rates somewhere around 2%. And then finally, the statewide net metering policy was the last scenario that they looked at. They looked at uniform net metering, again, full retail rate, 1-for-1, around the entire state. And as you can clearly see from this graph, that net metering policy generated from this computer model the most simulated market adoption. So if we keep net metering in place, or even potentially expand it statewide, that will lead to more adoption than all of the other scenarios, not put together, but all the individual scenarios independently of themselves. It's also important to note, I don't believe this was mentioned in the study, so I'm doing admittedly a little bit of extrapolation here, but that baseline study indicates no real changes. So it doesn't factor in some things. Some of these policy changes are actually already happening. We're definitely not seeing financing rates in the 2% range. So that's kind of a negative to the baseline already. We're also looking at some good things. The federal federal ITC was extended for 10 years. So those tax credits for behind the meter net metered solar installations are going to be at the full 30% for the foreseeable future. Focus on energy incentives have not changed. We don't really expect those to change anytime soon. So it is important to talk about from that baseline perspective, that red dot line perspective. If we were to actually hurt some of these policies rather than expand them or improve upon them, that baseline scenario, which again is kind of status quo, probably where we might be at, that adoption rate or that adoption amount could actually even be potentially a little bit lower. So as I said before, the policy change that drove by far the most adoption was that net metering policy. There are also a few conclusions that came out of that PSE Cadmus study that I'd like to highlight here. There were 7 identified conclusions from this study, but I want to point to conclusions 4 and 5 right now. You can read them. Essentially, what conclusion 4 says is that we do have some barriers right now, some policy barriers in our state to more solar adoption. We're not going to get that technical potential number. We're not going to get really anywhere close to there, but we can do more if we change some of these policies. But essentially what this study does is it identified that those barriers are in place. And then conclusion 5, again, I already said it, but it's good to hear someone else who has a lot more experience in this field say it. The most efficient strategy for accelerating the adoption of rooftop solar is through the implementation of a statewide net metering policy. So this really just goes to show that many different organizations, many different forces, including computer models, show NEM's net metering's importance and significance as we put this policy tool in our decarbonization tool belt. So we've gone through some of the market forces. We've gone through kind of all the good things right now around net metering. I want to take some time now to just address some of the issues or some of the concerns that come up, some of the counter arguments, maybe is a better way to say this, about net metering. And the main one is the cost shift myth. Cost shift myth. You have probably already heard about this, right? If a solar customer exports energy to the grid and then the utility compensates them for, that's money that they have to take from other non-solar customers, and that represents that cost shift myth. Or that represents what they consider, I should say, to be a cost shift. But I want to address that. There's a lot of ways that we could address that, but I'm going to address it through 2 main points. And the first main point is behind the meter, net metered solar installations, rooftop solar, lowers the demand on our grid. I already talked about this a little bit, but on-site distributed solar generation reduces the need for us to transmit electricity over long distances. Typically the way our grid is set up is we have power plants that are, maybe a little bit further away from where the electricity is used. And then we have to transmit and distribute that electricity to the users wherever that might be. More solar on the grid and dotting it kind of throughout our grid means that there's going to be, less wear and tear on the grid. There's going to be lower maintenance costs. There's going to be fewer utility upgrades, things like that. There's just going to be less demand required from those big power plants. And as we add in more energy, as we decrease demand, all ratepayers share in these savings. So it's a way to lower costs, actually lower costs, not raise them, but lower them for everyone. The other point I want to make here is on adoption rates. This is the other way this is the other main way, I should say, that we can kind of debunk this myth. So many studies across the US in different states and different areas, some with higher adoption solar rates than others, they all recognized that essentially this idea of a cost shift myth is just that. It's a myth. So for the vast majority of states, the effects of distributed solar prices remain negligible for the foreseeable future. Most of those studies don't show any issues with cost until we start to get into adoption rates. So a total amount of rooftop solar rates of 5 or 10, or in some cases, even 15%. We're not anywhere near that right now in Wisconsin. Most utilities are at or below 1%. Some of them might get into a 2% range, but that's about it. We're definitely not seeing those costs on the grid right now. So again, the benefits, especially the customer benefits and I'm talking about all customers, not just solar customers, but the utility customer benefits outweigh all of the other factors when we talk about how net metering impacts prices for non-solar adoption folks. So the last slide I want to do before we kind of move closer to the Q&A session is the risks to revising net metering policies. So currently right now, there are 2 utilities that are proposing changes in their rate cases that would definitely change the way net metering is calculated. Again, and I'm specifically talking about that full retail rate, that 1-for-1 rate. This is really bad. This is bad for many reasons. Alex is going to drop our net metering landing page into the chat right now. I don't want to go over those proposals in detail because we could take many hours just discussing those proposals in full. So if you're interested in learning more about the nuances and the details there, please check out our net metering page and check out those proposals. But essentially, risk to revising net metering, again, that full retail rate, makes investment very uncertain. We've seen in other states that have gone away from net metering, and the results have been pretty bad. Hawaii is a very good example. Hawaii has significantly higher adoption rates than Wisconsin does. And as that state made changes to its net metering policy, the solar industry took a very unfortunate dive down. So we definitely want to avoid that right now in Wisconsin. Our solar industry is just getting started. We're not quite babies or infants, but we're definitely more in the teenager range. So our industry needs a little bit more time to grow, and we need to get that industry a little bit more established here in Wisconsin. Essentially, though, again, doing away with that full retail value makes investment really uncertain. It makes return on investments hard to calculate. And it also, in some cases, makes these counter proposals to simple full retail value net metering kind of hard to understand, kind of confusing as well. This, as I said already, also impacts to local economy and to job growth. There was a study out of Virginia Virginia Commonwealth University, that concluded that every dollar that was invested in distributed solar in that state adds about 60 cents to Virginia's economy. There was another study out of New England is changes to net metering. It's going to slow the progress on our community and our statewide carbon goals as well. It's going to make those a lot harder to reach. And finally, of course, if net metering goes away, if the value of that one retail
I can't quite tell, but I was having issues with the connection, folks. So if anybody wants to just chat, if they're able to hear, so I know if this is still connected. Looks like Sam might have dropped off potentially. Can anyone confirm if they can hear us or not? Oh, so you guys can't. Okay, I see. Okay, they lost internet at the office. So Sam just texted me. I'm gonna go get a guitar. No, I'm just kidding. Um, so hopefully they're able to connect pretty quickly here. So Sam gets back on the call. Um, if not, maybe he'll try calling in. Um, in the meantime, I think it might be an opportunity to talk about how we go about designing a system and that the impacts that these net metering changes would have on how we design a system. So, as anyone that has solar knows, we're going to start by looking at the site, looking at shading impacts, looking at the condition of the roof. Looking at things like their current consumption levels based on historical data. And we're going to put all that information into our software and into our tools. And the hope is that we can take where they're at today, combine that with maybe some future plans for electrifying their transportation, adding an EV. So we'll try to factor in some of those future consumption changes if they're imminent, and then we basically generate a proposal that is as accurate as we can be. Obviously, there's always some assumptions that go into it, and we try to detail what those assumptions are. But currently, the way the net metering rules are structured, once we have that information of the homeowner's consumption on a monthly basis, the process of evaluating their savings is pretty straightforward. So, as opposed to when we think about the changes that have been proposed, one of the big challenges is that you can have all the information from the homeowner, and because those other aspects are going to vary and they are unknown, you still might not be able to provide an accurate savings calculation over the life of the system. So, basically for us, the variability from investor-owned utility to investor-owned utility already makes the job of designing pretty challenging. So when Sam talked a little bit about standardizing that metering, obviously that would make our lives a lot easier. If you knew that the cap in one territory was the same as it is in another territory, it would mean that you really only had to explain things one way. So the changes to net metering that I'm hoping that Sam is able to join again and to continue the discussion about would make the job of conveying accurate information a lot more difficult. Um, I do want to circle back to something else that Sam talked about, the equity piece. I don't think he quite got to get to that point, but this is something that jumped out at me too. Arch Solar and a lot of our competitors and peers in the industry, they have, um, they have started installing batteries with some of their customers. And sorry, Sam is just messaging me. I'm just letting him know people are still on. I'm covering for you. um, so batteries are a great emerging technology that pairs really well with solar. There's a lot of benefits to being able to store that power, whether it be for backup or in this case, a battery would provide security against these net metering changes. That's all fine and good, except that the majority of our customers, batteries are still a bit more expensive than they're ready to. They're a bit higher cost than most customers are ready or able to pull the trigger on. So what you end up with is a situation where if you can afford an additional $20,000 before the tax credit to add a battery, solar can still work out favorably for you financially. If you can't afford that extra cost, these proposals do sort of disincentivize folks who can't afford that battery from doing solar. That is definitely something that Sam was touching on before he dropped off that I think is uh, really motivating to me. That you look at, there's nonprofits like Elevate, for example. They've been doing some work finally in Wisconsin with low income housing, with low income housing providers who, those investments are, they have to pencil out for those folks. And so I think the equity piece of these changes, that it would disincentivize people who might benefit the most in other circumstances, I think is a real disservice. Just looking at some of the notes, and just so everybody knows, Sam is trying to reconnect. It sounds like they had an internet outage over at the office there. Um, Another question I think Sam was going to ask me had to do with, whether or not folks are asking about the net metering changes. And I think a lot, in large part, due to the work that Renew is doing to educate people, we are finally starting to get those questions from homeowners, like, how's this going to impact our payback? And one of the really tough things is right now we just don't know. Without going into the specifics, which is something that I think would, like Sam said, take a lot longer. Those changes, the proposals that were put out by the utility, I'm maybe hopeful that they're not going to just get accepted exactly as they were written the first time. I mean, to me, it seems like it's a back and forth and a negotiation between all the parties. I just want to say, like, from Arch's perspective and from my perspective, I love that the utilities are investing in solar. I think it's fantastic. I think to address climate change, it's an absolute necessity that the utilities invest in solar and put it in the fields and things like that. But I don't think it should be exclusively their domain either. I think that homeowners, farmers, landlords, and other working class folks should have the ability to have a predictable payback, and to have a playing field that's as level as possible, as levelized as possible. So this is really awkward. It looks like their internet might not get back on. I'll see if he wants to try the call-in number. I think he wanted to do a Q&A now, and I don't know how well I'm going to be able to facilitate that. The recording, I'm going to answer the ones that are easy. The recording will be presented online, saved online. Well, I should say the recording, but not the slide deck, will be online. Let me just see. These are all comments when I was asking about if you could hear me. Let me get down to the more substance here. So some of these questions are a little bit more about the specifics of, MGE versus Wisconsin Power and Light or Alliant. I want to try to avoid getting into those because I think that there's a lot of weeds, and I think that it is an active, for lack of a better word, negotiation or debate, if you will. Let me just see. So then it says, someone asked, is it up to the PSC to protect net metering? How can local representatives help support? I'd say local representatives, when Renew puts out the call to do public comments at the PSC, that's where you can really, I don't want to speak for Renew, but without them here, I would say those letter writing, the public comments on the docket, all of that stuff does make an impact. As far as the PSC, in their role of protecting net metering, I think the individual commissioners have to make the decisions on what they think is right based on their responsibilities to both the ratepayers and to the utilities. Just going to keep keep reading through some of these, and I see we still got a number of people on, so I'm just going to keep going through some of these questions that were in the chat. Um, and someone again asked about what they can do to help, and working with groups like Renew Wisconsin, with MREA and others that are involved in this is definitely a good way to get involved. Um, Someone again, a lot of people, and I love it, are asking like, how can we help stem the tide of some of these more extreme proposals? And I think that that's through that public comment, through if you're inclined to support Renew Wisconsin, or you're inclined to volunteer your time. Those are other great ways. So then, just getting towards the end of these questions here. If the reimbursement were retail, but is sent less than retail, so utilities would get a little something, how big would that impact be? If all they were asking for was a penny difference, I mean, I think I'd still show up to this meeting, but I would not be as, I don't think the industry would be as animated and nervous if they were talking about 16-cent retail rate, we're going to give you 15 cents. What they're talking about is much lower. And again, without going into the details on the proposals, it's a third or less is what they're looking to get put in place. Let's see. Someone said the PSE memorandum in February 2022 investigation of parallel generation rates has a great deal of complexity. Have you found this document helpful? I personally haven't, but yeah, I think that I'm sure folks at Renew have reviewed that extensively. Um, so I did just get a review or some info. It sounds like they had an internet outage, and it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to get on. Apologies for having to try to scramble and fill in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Hopefully this has been valuable time for folks. Sounds like there's a lot of interest in getting involved, and I want to thank everyone for their time, and wish them well as we continue this fight for net metering. Thanks.